Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network. And we are back now with our licensed clinical mental health coach. He is a, oh my goodness, pastor, author, university professor. There's always so much to your introduction. So I just want to welcome you and say hello. It's excited to have you here again as a counselor, as a friend, and all that you do. It's exciting to have you back. So Dr. Shaw, would you mind introducing yourself to our listeners today?
Very kind of you, Jill. Thank you. Yes, my name is Dr. Robert Shaw. Originally from the New Jersey, New York area, now live in North Carolina. I'm a licensed clinical mental health counselor in both North Carolina and Virginia. I teach at a university for undergrad psychology, but graduate level counseling classes as well. I've authored 6 books on what I call human core longings. Every human being have deep, long desires that need to be met. And oftentimes we try to meet them on our own power. And oftentimes because of that, we tend to get in trouble. So the books talk about how we can identify those longings and how they can be more healthily met. And I work with our military. I work with men, women, and teenagers when it comes to counseling.
Beautiful. Thank you. Great to have you back. I know you're from originally the New York area. And where are you based now?
In North Carolina.
Beautiful. But you have clients throughout the country, correct?
Well, I can't do that because I can only work with clients in the states in which I am licensed.
Which is
Virginia and North Carolina. Even if I have to do it through Zoom, there's a little bit of a gray area sometimes, but pretty much ethically, I have to make sure I stay within the states in which I'm licensed.
But anyone from any state, any country could buy his books, and he's got a lot of books to share as well. He is an author as well.
And I can be invited to come and do seminars.
Exactly, you're a public speaker, so you
are. And I can do that anywhere, yes.
Great. What did you have in mind for us today? And by the way, it's rbshaw.net, rbshaw.net is the website where you can find out more about you.
That's correct.
You've authored what, 6 books?
6 books. Mm-hmm.
Working on 7?
I have a 7th one that I began. It's not the 6 books I did write are in a series of these 6 core longings. And just briefly to mention them, we all have a desire to know who we are, our significance. And the title of the series is Created For. So we're created for significance. We're created for covering, which is a biblical term for safety. How we all desire to really feel safe in our environments, to be secure, particularly when it comes to relationships. Another one is a desire to know not just who we are, but what we're here for. What is our purpose? So that's created for purpose. Mm-hmm. Another one is understanding. If people can just hear my heart and listen to me, and let's communicate better and not assume and not project. If they can just understand me, it's something that we all long for, which is relationship building skills. So that's created for understanding. Another one is created for belonging. We all have a desire to belong to something that is so meaningful to our lives, oftentimes bigger than ourselves, whether it be a cause, whether it be a faith, whether it be an impact or a dream that we've pursued to make an impact in our society. We all have a desire to belong to something. Fraternities and teams and high school bands and organizations, with all kinds of clubs that people just want to join for that very reason. And then the last one is created for love. A love is a two-way street. We can be just as devastated. We can be devastated when we are not receiving the love that we all desire and crave that shows up in our caregiving. But we can be just as devastated if we are expressing and giving love and it gets rejected. So it is a two-way street.
Speaking of love, we got Valentine's Day around the corner.
That's right. That's right.
Good topic. And what other aspect do you want to get into? And I apologize. I know you mentioned at the beginning of the show you had notes. I'm not seeing them in my lineup here. Did you send them in?
No. I'm just talking about notes that I'm referring to right here in front of me.
Okay, perfect. Just want to make sure I'm not.
No.
Thank you. Okay, good. Continue.
Over the last couple of times we've been together, Jill, I've kind of given a bird's eye view of things that I feel are very impactful in mental health, in ministry, and so on. As I mentioned, we have a diagnostic book that mental health professionals use to diagnose folks with mental health conditions. Back in 1973, the book was about this big, maybe about half an inch big. Now it's about 2 or 3 inches bigger.
Wow.
And there's a lot of overlap. a tremendous amount of overlap when it comes to the criteria in terms of what we look for to provide a diagnosis. But there's basically 5 areas in which the diagnoses fall: anxiety, depression, grief, although grief itself is not in the DSM-5 because it's not a disorder. Grief is natural, but we tend to deal with it as unnatural, unwelcome, and very uncomfortable. But if we don't process grief, it can lead into depression. It can lead into perhaps some anxiety. So we have depression, anxiety, grief, addictions, and trauma. Those are the 5 major buckets that a lot of, in fact, not most of mental health areas fall into. We've touched on a little bit of trauma. We've touched a little bit on grief and depression and anxiety over the last several times that you and I have been together. Today, I want to focus on addictions in our time. Addictions right now are the #1 health concern in our country.
Wow.
And addictions show up in more than just substance abuse. It also can be behavioral, such as gambling, shopping, and one of the biggest ones, pornography. In fact, 66% of what's on the World Wide Web is sexual in nature. So it's very easy to get sucked into pornography because it's at our fingertips. We don't carry cell phones, we don't carry pocket phones or mobile phones anymore, as they used to be called. We carry cell phones, which is basically a pocket computer.
Absolutely,
And
yeah.
I still have to wrap my head around that, to be honest with you, because I use it primarily as a phone. But yeah, you can access Facebook and internet and your emails and you name it. You can Google and all these apps. You can have an app for anything. And so you have a pocket computer that gives you access to just about anything you have at your fingertips. And one of the problems with that can lead to things like pornography, because again, 66% of what's on the World Wide Web is sexual in nature. One of the things I want to touch on, again, in our time together, which is brief, is, in my opinion, because I worked with addicts and I continue to work with addicts. I grew up in an alcoholic home. My father was an alcoholic, and he would pick fights with my brother and I. He was one of those that was very aggressive when he was drunk. When he was sober, he was a wonderful guy. It changes you when you're drunk, or when you're high, or when you're on a particular substance. And he drank himself to sleep one night and never woke up. He was only 64. So I know what it's like. My wife grew up in an addict home. Her mom was the alcoholic, and she died behind the wheel drunk while she was driving. So it's a devastating endeavor when addictions are occurring in a person's life, but it's also been studied that an addict affects at least 5 other people around them. And I have heard so many times, Jill, especially when it comes to pornography or drinking or something like that, people would say to me, well, I'm not hurting anybody. I'm doing this all on my own time. Well, that's a lie. In fact, one thing about addicts is that they're very, very good at manipulation and deception. And when they make that kind of comment, I'm not hurting anybody, the studies show just the opposite. And one addict can affect at least 5 other people, whether it be because of abuse, whether it be because of neglect, whether it be because they financially drain a family because of their addictions. That happened to my family. My father grew up, my grandfather was an alcoholic, and he died directly of cirrhosis of the liver, which is a direct effect of alcohol poisoning. And he would come back from work and basically drink his money, his income. And my uncles, my dad's older brothers, when they got out of high school, they had to go right to work just to provide for the family because of their father's addictions. So I see that. I've known that. I've seen that firsthand. One of the things about addictions, again, getting back to my opinion, we are treating addictions incorrectly. We are treating addictions from a medical model. And by doing so, we are missing the entire root of the whole thing. We treat it as a medical model because we believe it's a disease. I cannot tell you how the studies show and people talk about that alcoholism is a disease.
Mhm.
And this is where the root of it is, because I did my dissertation on this. Bill Wilson was a man who started Alcoholics Anonymous back in 1936. He had an alcoholic problem. He went to a medical doctor who was one of his best friends. And I can't remember that gentleman's name at the top of my head right now.
Mhm.
And he went to this friend doctor of his to get treatment for his alcoholism. And the doctor tried a few things and said, you know, Bill, I can't help you. There's nothing I can do to help you. And in Bill Wilson's writings, he did say that alcoholism is like a disease, but he never called it a disease. And what he meant by that was an addiction is like a disease because it encompasses and takes over your life like a disease does. And it needs your attention to get over it. That's all he meant by it. What happened to Bill Wilson was he had a religious experience. In his writings, he claims that and he reports that. Which is why when he put together Alcoholics Anonymous and the 12-step program, which most rehab centers use, in that 12-step program, he talks about getting with your higher power. Because he himself had a religious experience, and when he had that experience, it caused him to be transformed, and he became sober from that day forward. So in that 12-step program, getting to your higher power, and however you view God is important, but in Christianity, the power of God obviously is through God and through his son, Jesus Christ. But every rehab, even AA meetings still talk about those 12-step programs in mentioning God's higher power. Generally speaking, rehab centers have about a 20% graduation rate because they treat it with a medical model. Now, how they measure the graduation rate typically is from the day you begin treatment until about a year later after you graduate from treatment. That's how they measure that graduation rate. So about 20%, there's about 20% graduation rate in the normal everyday rehab centers that people go to, which is not very high. With an organization such as Teen Challenge, which is a faith-based approach to dealing with substance abuse, to dealing with addictions. It's a faith-based approach. Teen Challenge over the years, which has been around since 1959, has almost an 80% graduation rate because they're dealing with more than just the addiction. And this is where we fall short. What we wind up seeing oftentimes is we deal with a person who's coming into counseling or coming into rehab centers or coming into 90-day programs, and we're dealing with the addiction itself, which is proper to get them sober so that they can deal with perhaps what it is that's driving the addiction to begin with. As long as they stay drunk, as long as they stay high or connected to whatever the choice of addiction is, it's going to be very difficult for them to deal with it and overcome it. So yes, getting sober is very important, but that's not the only way, because what happens is, because there's only a 20% graduation rate, give or take that 80% people will go back to the same addiction or they'll switch addictions because they haven't dealt with the basic issue. I have a couple of quotes from individuals who themselves dealt with addictions. One is a gentleman by the name of Mark Laser. He had a sexual addiction and almost ruined his life and his marriage and family. He wrote, "Addiction is also an escape from feelings." Dr. Terry Wardle, who dealt with addictions in his own life, but also ministered to many addicts, wrote, "Life experiences often leave deep wounds that compromise a person's well-being. We all go through life wounded, whether it be through grief, whether it be through trauma, whether it be through poverty, whether it be through neglect. There's a lot of things that wound us as human beings. As I mentioned once before, sometimes we underestimate or we poo-poo scripture as to say it's all about it's a book that doesn't really relate to things. Well, I look at scripture as the description of human condition in which God comes in to redeem. It's much more than what people think. And one example of that is in Proverbs. It says in Proverbs 18:14, it says, a man's illness he can deal with, but a broken spirit who can bear? So the brokenness that we experience in life affects us much, much more in most people's lives than a medical condition. So Dr. Wardle goes on and says, left unaddressed, these wounds that go through that occur in our lives, left unaddressed, these hurts give birth to false beliefs about ourselves, about the world around us. Emotional upheaval and behaviors that are ultimately destructive. So I boil it down like I typically like to do. I like to boil things down in a very bite-sized but very truthful position. Addicts and addictions are driven by basically two things. One, to silence negative messages. And what I mean by that is this. We grow up in an environment, we're raised by parents, or maybe just one parent, or maybe by a grandparent, depending on the situation. And as we grow up, we are given messages as youngsters. Sometimes they're positive messages like, you did just a great job today, Johnny. Oh, I love how your dress looks on you today, Susie. Those types of messages are wonderful, that affirming, and they build up that child as they grow. But there's also very many negative messages that we get to hear. Like, oh, come on, you're never going to amount to anything. You're always going to make a mistake. I don't love you at all. You don't belong to me. You're just my stepkid. Things like that. Those messages that get attached to our spirit, and they break us. They do. The power of the tongue is one of the most powerful forces in the world. Even in the book of James in the New Testament, it says the tongue is like a rudder to a ship. If you think about a cruise line may be having 15 stories of where people can sleep and stay and all these compartments. A huge, huge ocean liner has a tiny little rudder that causes that ship to steer. And the tongue is likened to a rudder. It's a tiny little thing, but it does a lot of power, and it can steer people, and it can make an effect. So basically, it's to silence negative messages. When we grow up and we have, by becoming an adult, we hear things like, I'm always going to fail. I'm always going to fail. I'm never good enough. Nobody's ever going to love me. We hate those negative messages, and we want to silence them. So by pouring out our lives into addictions, or whatever the addiction may be, gives us a chance to silence those when we're high, drunk, and distracted by that particular behavior. It provides a sense of well-being. It does, unfortunately. But the problem is, it's only short-lived. So that's why any addiction, for the most part, continues to progress and get worse and worse, because what was called for in the beginning to silence those messages doesn't remain enough. You need to have more in order for that to continue. And the second reason people seek out addictions is to medicate pain. It could be physical pain, mental pain, or emotional pain. Because human nature, the most powerful thing that we desire to do in human nature is to avoid pain at all costs. We will do anything possible to avoid pain and discomfort. Unfortunately, that's impossible. But when we are dealing with pain, when we don't know how to deal with it, unfortunately, we will look for things to silence those messages and to deal with that pain of whatever it may be. But again, it's short-lived when it comes to addictions. So what is being missed? I say all that to say this. What's being missed is, if we're dealing with addictions under a medical model, primarily we're dealing with the individual to help them overcome the addiction itself, and only that. What we need to do is go after what was broken in their spirit to begin with, which drives every addiction from the foundation. And when I deal with individuals, that's what I go after. I said, what trauma did you experience in your life? What kind of messages did you hear when you were growing up? What were some of the most painful experiences you've ever had? And we'll talk about that, and then we will process it in a very healthy way so they are no longer driven by what drives their addiction.
Coming from a background, my father was a drug addict as well. So gosh, growing up it was so hard and difficult on my family. And you don't know what's happening when you're young. You just know your parents aren't getting along, and then finally in your teens you figure out what's the true story, and that had a huge effect on us. I mean, still
Sure
to this
did.
day, there's
Sure did.
he was into, besides marijuana, but cocaine, which we didn't know. Not that marijuana is better than whatever, but then we never knew that. So it was like, oh, I know
Yeah.
that smell. Oh, that's a drug. Okay, that's marijuana. But then to find out later that he did cocaine, and that's why there were so many financial problems. My parents weren't getting along, and it was
Yep.
really, it
It
wreaked
affected
havoc
a lot
on
of
us.
people.
And there's
Yeah.
3 in our family. So my
Really?
sister's oldest, so she was the quiet one. My brother became the drug addict, and then
Okay.
I became the overachiever. So going to seek mental health counseling
Uh-huh.
in high school, I started, and I was told that every kid, there's one becomes the class clown, one usually falls in the, like, everyone has
Correct.
their own way
Correct.
of coping and dealing. Not to say anyone's way is better, but everyone went through something, and it's unfortunate because
Yeah.
I sought help in high school and after high school, and I'm still not perfect and I'm not great. I still
None
have
of us
never
are.
touched, I've never
Yeah.
in my life ever touched an illegal drug because I saw what it did to my family.
That's how I
Never.
felt about alcohol. Yes.
Never,
Yeah.
ever, ever,
Yeah.
ever, never done pot, never done anything.
Yeah.
And it made me who I am today, but then it gives me fear. It gives me, that brought on fear of men, because now I can't trust men like my father. So
Wow.
there's always
Wow.
it affects
Yes.
and trickles down, and
It
just
does.
letting you know that I can relate and I can empathize with your conversation. And thank you for sharing about your family. And
Yeah.
to this day, my brother is still, he's just not right. I mean, he's got a daughter, but he's not fully together. But
Yep.
everyone gets affected differently, and then you want the best for your generation. So how do you stop that? Right? You think you have it, but then at the same time, well, now I have this fear of relationships because I saw what
Yeah.
the drugs did to my dad. So I'm single with my 2 kids, and everyone, you have these problems. I'm pointing to my gut. They're just instinct. How do you get rid of that? At this age, in your 40s now,
Yeah.
you want to make the best life for your family. So I do work with people later in life who have these problems from childhood, in a sense, and it's still affecting them.
Yes.
It's a root cause of what's going on in my life. And yes, I'm not a drug addict, that's great, but then I also have trust issues, and relationship issues because of
Yeah.
it. So again, nobody's life is perfect, but
No, it isn't. And you said it very correctly. We need to go after the root cause, and that's not often done. In fact, it's very rarely done when addictions are being addressed. I'm supervising a gentleman right now in Virginia who's getting his license. He's gaining his hours, and he's working in a rehab center, an opioid rehab center. And the opioid right now is one of the most prominent drugs right now.
Yeah.
And he's dealing with folks who come in to deal with their opioid addictions, and they have to, by nature, according to this particular setting, see a counselor every time they come in for at least 30 minutes, if not more. But they also come in for a dose. In other words, for an injection or another type of drug to help them overcome the opioid. Well, again, that approach is strictly dealing with the medical aspect, because if you're giving somebody something else to address what you want them to overcome, you're really not helping them very much.
And by the way, does that contain opioids in it as well? Like a weakened form?
No.
Not at all. It's not it's not like weaning someone off of something, but it's something that
no, but the message is that, but the message
Yeah.
there is, okay, in order for me to get over this one substance, I got to hold on to this substance, even if it's healthy. In fact, the number one, or the fastest growing, not the number one, the fastest growing addiction right now is to prescription drugs. The fastest growing is to prescription drugs.
Wow.
Number one is alcohol.
Okay.
But the fastest growing is prescription drugs. And because we get hooked on that too.
Wow.
To, again, overcome pain, whatever the pain may be. But it's not overcoming it, it's just appeasing it.
Numbing it in a
Numbing
sense.
it.
And
Numbing
then,
it and appeasing it. Yeah.
and then in the end, and it's not going to work anymore. And you're going to go for more, and it just, that whole
I look
spiral
back at my
down.
father's life. My father was a combat Marine during World War II. And he was in Iwo Jima
Mhm.
He was in the Battle of Okinawa. And my dad never talked about any of that stuff, just like that generation didn't,
Yeah.
except the goofy stuff that the guys would do,
Yeah,
when they're in the military. And I didn't know that until several years later, just several years ago. My dad passed away in 1988. Just several years ago, I wrote away to the government for his military records. And it was only then that I realized what he did
Oh.
and where he was. And I was in tears. I honestly was in tears because the pain he had was what he saw in combat.
Oh.
He survived those brutal, brutal battles that many of his comrades did not.
Hmm.
Then when my mother passed away, as I mentioned, in our first time together, I was 17. My dad was in his 50s. Or was he in his 50s? Yeah, he was 50 years old when my mom passed away. So when she died, I'm sure it triggered the death of other people. And from that day, from the day my mom died, his alcoholism spiraled upwards until it killed him.
Oh, gosh.
I didn't know it then, but that's what I look back on now.
Well, I love the fact that you took your hardships in life and look what it made you do. Now you're helping so many people like who went through the same thing you did. That's pretty awesome. That.
Well, as I
it
mentioned
happened.
before, once I learned that, God desires to come alongside of us. The importance of others surrounding you and coming alongside of you
Yep.
is priceless and immeasurable to help someone overcome whatever it may be. And it doesn't even have to deal with addictions, but depression and anxiety, whatever it is. Having someone come alongside of you to make you feel like you are cared for, that you are important, that indeed you are significant, let alone the fact that God wants to come alongside of you to ultimately to transform and to do the healing that only he can do.
Beautiful. Thank you, Robert. And if we do want to reach out to you, could you give us your number and website?
Yeah, the website once again is www.rbshaw.net. And on the website, you can obtain my books, is also my email address and phone number.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. Pleasure having you here. Really, we appreciate it. And looking forward to the next time we speak. Thank you so much.
Jill, thank you for sharing your story too. I appreciate that.
Thank you. And to all of our listeners, viewers, please stay tuned. More of the show is on the way.
Hello, my name is Dr. Robert Shaw. I'm a clinical mental health counselor, pastor, university professor, and an author of 6 books dealing with human core longings and how to meet those in healthy ways. If you are struggling with mental health issues, or your organization, or your church, or your group is looking to better integrate meaningful relationships, contact me at rbshaw.net, rbshaw.net, and I will be glad to come and provide a conference, seminar, and speaking engagement to bring people together to integrate spirituality, relationship building skills, and psychological truths that allow people to have meaningful understandings and meaningful relationships. Thank you.
Are you looking for even more of the podcasts and hosts that you love? The Podcast Business News Network is proud to announce that you can now listen live on the MyTuner Radio and online Radio Box apps for iOS, Android, and the Amazon App Store. Or check us out online. Search for Business News Network on mytuner-radio.com or search Podcast Business News Network on onlineradiobox.com/US so you don't miss a minute of the action.
Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
For nearly 2,000 severely injured veterans, everyday life has become filled with barriers.
Day-to-day simple tasks can become pretty daunting.
I have to carry my chair up 2 flights of steps or have somebody do it for me.
What scares me the most is just the falling.
When I'm struggling with my house, I think, to have that one great barrier just knocked down, it's crucial.
Home for Our Troops is a wonderful nonprofit that builds a
mortgage-free, fully adaptive, handicap-accessible house.
And there's no catch.
It'll be our very first home that we've ever owned.
This is a game changer.
This is where your life begins again.
We need you to join us in completing this important mission. Please visit hfotusa.org and help build homes and rebuild lives.
Because of you, everything's going to be okay.